Be as loving and kind with yourself as you possibly can. And know that sometimes the pain doesn't mean you're crazy. It just means you're human. And some people will get it and some people will not. And that's okay. They might not have the capacity to handle it. But that doesn't make them bad. It just means they don't have the capacity.
You're listening to Guards Down. This is Greg Washington.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Guards Down. I have with me today Leslie Porter. How are you, Leslie?
I'm well. How are you?
I can't complain at all. Leslie, please tell us about yourself.
Well, first of all, I'm so excited to be here. And so thank you for having me. And a little about myself, I have actually a program online called Holistic Lifestyle Method. And I'm trained in various yoga practices, meditation practices. I'm trained in Pilates, a couple of variations of Pilates, and I'm a somatic counselor. And so I work a lot with different issues like stress and anxiety and sleep issues and energy issues, stuff that seems to be up your alley too. And you talk about a lot. So it's great to be here and talk to you about it. I've been doing this kind of work actually for 20 years too. So it's cool to talk about.
Awesome. So everybody, just so you know, you can tell where we're already going to go with this. We have a true mental health professional that is into alternative medicine that is going to just open up and share some things with us, and we'll be able to put some things into our toolkit, that'll help us along the way. And so, you told me you were a professor as well, right? For 16 years?
Yeah, I've been teaching actually yoga, Pilates, and meditation at a community college in Los Angeles for the last 16 years.
So there we go. We got the real deal. Maybe I can get some breathing techniques before we
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And it's, if you, with COVID going on, we're all online. So that brings its own stressors. But so I'm sure teachers could probably use this podcast right now.
Indeed. And I'm glad you bring that up because, we started to mention in the beginning portion of us talking how what we're dealing with in the world today can exacerbate directly what, we're personally dealing with. And so I just kind of want to get into the mind frame of people dealing with trauma and grief and how it all affects the body and mind.
Well, there's so many, one thing I think is really important is to recognize that we're all different expressions. We all have different experiences. And even if we are connected and we're, a collective humanity, I think each person's unique expression is that it's unique. So their story is going to be different. Their history is going to be specific to them, their family, their culture, all those things. Even if, you share a similar race with other people or a similar class or a similar gender, I think that your experience is going to be yours. It's going to be very specific to you. So whatever it's translating through your body itself is going to be specific to you. I mean, there's some ways that can happen right now, which is, I've heard a lot in terms of sleep problems, suddenly oversleeping, undersleeping, low energy. I keep hearing people talk about Zoom fatigue, but I think that, sure, anyone in front of a computer so much is going to be fatigued, but I think there's another level of that, of like, this is exhausting. You know what I mean? Like, this is it. Like, let's be real about it. It's not just Zoom fatigue. Like every hour there's like new information and it's exhausting. And it's like, who do you trust? How do you navigate? So I think that's exhausting. And then it can play out with tension in the body itself, right? Some people get headaches. Some people get shoulder tension. They're like this, or digestive issues. It can play out with like overeating, undereating, over exercising, right? Like a lot of people like, oh, I'll just exercise, I'll feel better. Reactivity. We talked about that a little bit before this interview too. People getting snappy.
Mm-hmm.
People getting snappy, or dissociation.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the one thing I think is so important is these are the ways our bodies cope with it, but it's not bad. They're messages to remind us like, okay, wait, this is what I'm, either I'm activated, but they're not bad. They're just the way we've learned to cope with something.
Mm-hmm.
Not a bad thing. It only comes bad if it harms someone else or yourself.
Well, let's talk about trauma and grief. And so I firmly believe, just on my experiences, that trauma and grief shapes your life. It shapes your why, as far as who you become. It shapes how you endure what you're going through, and how you transition to the different roles that you'll have in life.
Yeah.
And so I just kind of wanted to get your take on it.
Well, I think, can you say that one more time? So let me rephrase it and make sure I'm getting what you're saying, because I want to make sure I'm hearing it. That basically you're saying that trauma happens and it affects all areas of your life, and that in some ways you almost become a different person. And then you're learning to navigate how to become that person through the tumultuous pieces of trauma, stress, or anxiety, or whatever that is. Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely true. And I think it also depends on what the trauma is. So let's say the trauma is a car accident, and you get really injured in a car accident, and you actually don't have the mobility in your head or neck anymore that you had before the car accident. And so you have to learn how to be in your body now, heal the injuries and the scar tissue, but then learn how to navigate that lack of movement or gain movement, which is variation of what you're saying, the mental stuff, right? But there's mental stuff that goes along with that physical stuff, right?
Correct.
So in somatic counseling, we work with the body itself, not to overwhelm it, but we're trying to get the body's organic intelligence on board. So I want you to think of it as putting it's almost like we're spreading puzzle pieces all over the table, and then doing various practices to help bring those puzzle pieces back together, so that, because I think trauma and those kinds of problems, what happens is we start to feel very fragmented, like these puzzle pieces. And so working with an expert really helps us get those puzzle pieces back together, so we could get the nervous system on board and not get so activated or overwhelmed. So we can navigate, but without capacity and nervous system regulation to some extent, and not diving just deep into trauma and letting it be a slow process, because it is a slow process for the long-term results, the body could go into override and exhaustion. It's too much for the body to push through.
That makes sense. Sense.
Slow is so much better. I know sometimes we don't want that. A lot of people are like, no, I just want to feel better. It's of course you want to feel better. But, if you put a Band-Aid on top of something, but really you need surgery, it's probably better to get the surgery and let it heal over time versus just put a Band-Aid on top of it and pretend it's not there.
Yeah. Okay.
Did I answer the question?
You did.
I wasn't sure. I was like, did I do that? Okay.
Too funny. Yeah, you definitely answered the question.
Okay, cool.
We're going to have an exciting and a fun episode. Of course, what we talk about is heavy, but it's also enlightening. And so the reason why we can laugh and smile through all of this is because understanding that putting in the work to getting better should be positive, should be empowering.
Yes.
As well. And so being able to smile and laugh and just to, enjoy conversation with someone else who you can learn from, you can share with. I mean, that's power in itself and healing in itself. So I appreciate that.
I love it. And, the one thing that I think, that as mentioned, it's that there's something to be said for like authenticity there's always these two pieces of, there's some crap that goes on, which is not good. And then there's sometimes out of those traumas, and I'm not saying trauma is okay. That's not what I'm saying. But I've noticed that out of trauma, when someone starts to resolve and suddenly they start to heal, there's this really deep, I get so, honestly, it's so inspiring, because it's probably why I do what I do. Because when I see someone actually healing, I'm just like, this is the most beautiful thing. There was a client I just started working with 2 weeks ago, and she realized after our first session that she had never grieved her father. Her father died 6 years ago, and she never grieved her dad. She's gone to therapy, ministers, all of these people. They've done different things, coaches, and I'm a body-centered practitioner. And so we did some stuff like first session on Zoom, and she said to me, I've been crying on and off for a week. I didn't realize how much grief I was holding in my body. So her body was holding all this pain. And for some people, they'd be like, of course I have empathy for grief and all of that, but there's something so beautiful and like freeing when someone gets to feel their authentic grief. It's so cool. And yeah. I just get so happy about it, because it's like, I see the freedom, because now they're connecting with something real now. It's not being masked over. So there is joy in that, if that makes sense. There's like you said, empowerment. Yeah.
No, I definitely, I get it. I do. So good deal. So when we talk about trauma and grief and what a person goes through, explain to us collateral damage.
What do you mean by collateral damage?
So for me, when I talk about trauma and grief, I look at it as, I experience a traumatic event.
Right.
And because of that experience, it has now forever changed me. And it could be in a good or a bad way. And so how I act and move about there now affects the people around me. Mm. And so I'll give a deeper example of a soldier with PTSD and anger issues now coming home and taking it out on his family and them having to deal with it.
They're all going to, does the VA they must have different practitioners there, right? The VA?
Yeah, of course. Uh-huh.
I was going to say they better for things like that, because they're all going to, in some ways, depending on what's happening for them, each person affected is probably going to need, it almost would be better to get a mediator in there beginning, like immediately, someone to talk to them all at one point to figure out like what makes sense to our family right now. Yeah. Do we have a timeout symbol? Does the person who's angry need to remove themselves? Because my guess is they don't want to take their anger out on these people. These people love them. So my guess is the anger is just being activated. That's their activation from something terrible that has nothing to do with these particular people. Mm-hmm. So if there's some sort of mediation that can happen beforehand to get them to have some sort of game plan of what makes sense while the soldier is healing, I think that would be really beneficial. Because otherwise it's like they won't know what the heck to do.
Correct. Or, give another example of friends and family now having to deal with a person committing suicide?
I really want to encourage people not to do these things on their own, because I think sometimes we get really Google friendly. Like, let me just search this on Google and see if I can heal it. And actually, there was an article on LinkedIn today about this very inexpensive therapy app that has been sharing people's private information and is just, I get it was inexpensive, and I get why people would want to do inexpensive therapy, especially right now. But I think it's important to seek help from professionals that are empowering to help you get through something like that, because something like suicide is very, very, very hard for everyone around them, not just the family, the friends that felt like they might be blaming themselves, or that's very challenging.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think that they need to make sure they have someone to support the energy of grief is, even if it doesn't matter how, grief is very similar in the sense of that process, right? The shock, the anger, the sadness, there might be some self-blame, all of those things need to be addressed. And being as compassionate as possible with everyone involved.
Mm-hmm. Now, for me, you talked from the standpoint of this event happening and you're having to deal with it, like the person who's dealing with the collateral damage, getting help and seeking help. I'm more so wanting to talk to the person who is inadvertently dishing out the collateral damage. Because I want them to think about their actions and how it not only affects them, but the people around them.
It's really hard when someone is not in their right mind. I think sometimes they don't realize how damaging they're actually being. And it's funny. I'm going to bring an example in here that is not war-based, but child abuse-based, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I had a client I was working with a few years ago, and she was very much abused by her parents and very much neglected when she was a kid. She's in her 60s, 70s now, so she's older. And ironically, I don't know if she realized it, but her daughter actually started seeing Me Too around the same time. And they both actually were saying that what was really challenging is that the mother, the one I was also working with, who was abused, she has so much anger from being a kid that she takes it out on her partner, her daughter, who's in her 30s now, still taking this anger out, like having huge rages, screaming at them, attacking them, yelling at them. It is bad, like how toxic it is sometimes out of nowhere. Literally just like out to dinner and then suddenly like a big, that's kind of what you're describing as well, right? Some variation of that, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so one of the things that we had to personally work on was recognizing that, and what she realized, the more she was gaining compassion for herself, like deep compassion, especially for the young kid that was seriously abused, she started realizing, oh my God, I'm taking this out on everyone around me. Mm. And what she did was, and it's a work in progress. She's definitely, it's not overnight. But what I noticed was that moment before the anger, if there's a way to feel and recognize the impulse, like, oh, wow, right? What happens with anger? It's heated. There's a lot of heat suddenly in the body, or you're starting to sweat, or your mind starts to race, or what happens before the anger? Is there a way to track that What's the trigger? And if you can stop for a second and track it and step back a second and recognize, wow, I'm really pissed off right now. I'm going to remove myself before I harm someone, or before I scream at someone, or before I don't know, break a glass or something. And like, she was actually breaking silverware and glasses and like throwing things. Like she was pissed.
Yeah.
But what she started to do was she'd look at her husband would piss her off, and she'd be like, okay, I'm having an impulse. I'm going on a walk. She literally would like walk out and go on a walk, like a fast walk, or she'd lock herself in the room for a second to calm down, to like let the anger, because anger is energy. Mm-hmm. What is the anger energy?
Yeah, no, I like how you put that. Recognize and feel the impulse. That's the first time I've heard it said like that, and so it definitely makes me think about the body and what you're going through. It is energy. Your body's getting heated. Your heart is racing. Like, I can definitely recognize that.
Can I mention one more thing before
yes.
you? There's like each emotion is an energy. And with each emotion and energy is going to be a different temperature and a different whatever. And so there's somatic ways of going at it. There's yoga ways of going at it. There's like different practices that actually, in food even, that like goes into different things depending on where someone is struggling. I just want to throw that in there, that like that's why I hate the one size fits all healing method, because you've got to address it if someone tends to be cold all the time, the worst thing to do is to give them like the worst thing to do is giving them like a cold practice, like eat salads all the time or whatever, and same thing with someone who's heated all the time. The last thing you want to do is like give them salsa and peppers all the time. You know what I mean? Because it's just going to make one colder or one hotter. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That do. Now, when you spoke about earlier, about your client and child neglect, which I just realized was I don't know if it's a disorder in itself or a condition.
I think it's an experience. Like
an experience,
It can definitely be traumatizing. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's because I think it's important there are some things that are mental illnesses, like real mental illnesses and like chemical imbalances. And I don't think of PTSD as that. I think if someone has a mental illness like bipolar or whatever, they really need to go to a psychiatrist, because that's chemical. That's something in here.
Correct.
But with PTSD and trauma-based stuff, that's a specific moment of time. It's a moment of time that was unsafe.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, for some, the nervous system starts to think that everything is unsafe based off that. That's when sometimes you're in like a PTSD thing, because that story isn't happening now, but the story keeps happening in your mind or body. That's a little different than like a mental illness, though.
Yeah. Okay. And so you bring up a good point of PTSD. I've talked to numerous people, and what I found is that there are 3 terms that are floating out there. PTS, PTSI, and PTSD. So post-traumatic stress injury, and post-traumatic stress disorder.
Don't you love how there's always like a label for something?
Right.
They're going to be like PTSD, whatever, big toe, like post-traumatic stress, like always. Yeah, I've heard variations of that myself, but I'm not as familiar with various stuff like that. No, I usually address the stressors that are coming through the system.
Yeah, so you just look at it as stress on the body.
But the body affects the mind.
And the mind, yeah.
Well, the one thing, you'd asked me this earlier off camera. One of the things that is interesting is that certain traumas in the body, you actually don't want to go to the body first, because that's where the trauma is, and they're not going to be able to regulate if you go right to the that problem. So you have to teach someone to get that it's safe outside and then slowly come back to the body.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk about coping skills.
Yeah.
I did an interview recently with a young lady, and she talked about how the first, I'll just call it violation, or first traumatic experience kind of sets the tone and the path for how you deal with things. And so I normally ask my guests, did your parents or role models or, family around you teach you how to deal with trauma and grief?
No.
And a lot of people say no, they do.
I think they taught me like what not to do. Like, don't do this. Okay. Well, I think they modeled like that behavior of like, don't do this. One thing with my mom though, is when I was maybe 12 or something, I was having a really, really hard time in my life. And she literally was like, I hope this helps you. And ironically dropped me off at a yoga studio. We're talking like 80s or like late 80s, early 90s, and just literally dropped me off at a yoga studio that was by our house and said, I'll pick you up after class. And that was sort of the beginning of this understanding of, she wasn't really into it. Mm-hmm. But for whatever reason, I don't know where she got that, but it really helped me navigate that period. And I actually went to that yoga studio like 2 to 3 times a week for years. And then that was really helpful with my mother. She knows that. I mean, she knows that was a period where she really helped me get that. Even though she didn't model that, for whatever reason, she got me to do that. And I would say, even though I've always been a very spiritual person, and even before that, and I was always studying, for fun, I was studying dreams and always like reading and psychic phenomena was fascinating to me. There was something about going to those yoga classes, I think, that started to set this pace of where I would go next without realizing it. Even though I was studying other things, it just kept coming back to that for me over and over again through my life. And then it just kind of, everything just I kept asking questions, which ended up being another training. And so I think it was the beginning of it.
Yeah. So when we talk about this, the question then becomes, what parenting advice would you teach or would you give parents on teaching their kids how to deal with trauma and grief and resilience?
Ooh. Well, I think I'd give what I would give anyone, which is really learn to actively listen. Really be there and listen and support. And notice if your capacity, your child, especially the mom, your child will only have as much capacity as you have. So if you don't have any capacity, that's something that's really important to own. And then you probably need to get help so you can increase your capacity. If you have the capacity, rock on and literally be a support system for your child. And, I'm thinking right now of a mom who came to me recently. Her daughter was really struggling, and she's still struggling. She's not sleeping. Half of her family just died in the last year. And now the child is scared that her parents are going to die any second. And then COVID, that started before COVID. And then now we have COVID, and then, and they're Black. And so then the Black Lives Matter movement was going, and George Floyd and everything. And so the kid was really freaking out, not sleeping, and totally, like you can imagine that just escalates, right? Like half your family dies off, then there's COVID, then there's, all this stuff. So the mom and I were talking, and one of the things that she realized is okay, so she needs to also gain capacity, take space, work on her own stuff separately. Don't bring your stuff to the child. Because what was happening a little bit is the kid was pulling some of her stuff with her. She was pulling some of her anxiety they were like kind of merging the anxiety between them. So she needed to gain more capacity, and she realized that. And then from there, she could be a support and like hold her hand and listen to her. And what do you need? What can I do? And try not to assume and fix it. That's not really listening. That's just telling someone what to do. There's a difference. Mm-hmm. Between, like, let's say you came to me and you said, I'm really upset right now, and, I'm having a hard time. And me going, what can I do to help? Like, do you want me to listen? Do you want me to be here? What do you need? Versus, you should do X, Y, Z. That's a different energy.
Yeah. So listening versus giving advice is a different energy. And the biggest key to helping someone is having the capacity to be there for them. The patience, the understanding, and the willingness.
Well, you brought up something really good. I mean, I think you said it, and I'm going to say it in a different way, but I'm going to say it this way, but I think you'll understand because you kind of said it yourself, that you can only receive and have the capacity to handle emotions that you can handle within yourself. So if you don't have the capacity to handle grief, which is very painful, I've had people die in my life. It's not a happy situation. It's really, especially when it's out of the blue, it's awful. And, and people, I think some people really don't know how to respond in grief, because they'll say something like, they're in a better place now, or this is a good opportunity for you to grow, or they'll say some, their intention is good, but they'll say some sort of
don't want to hear that shit.
Comment to you. And you're sort of like, this feels like the most inauthentic response. Like, can I cuss on this? Am I okay? It's okay to cuss on this interview?
Completely.
Okay, cool, because I really, really want to. It's so, like, let's say someone was in an accident, and they died in that accident, and they have a lover or something. They only want to hear how fucked up that was. They don't want to hear about, oh, they're in a better place and you're going to be fine and what. No, it's fucked up. Like, let's acknowledge the truth of something. And how do we, and I think, I know that because I've been on that other side before, and you probably know that because you've been on the other side of what you've been on. Does that make sense? So, like, if we don't have the capacity or don't know what that means, it doesn't mean we all need to experience that. It just means that to have empathy, we need to, either the person or the child or whoever needs to try to communicate the best they can so the parent understands or the friend understands that sometimes they just need you to be there. And there's nothing you can say except be your presence. Your presence. It's not even like your physical presence. It's like that. There's a way where someone feels you are there. They feel you're there. You're present with them. And sometimes that is enough. It depends on what the person needs. But I know for myself, sometimes when someone is just present with me and they're just talking to me and they're not just saying, like, I don't know, you could feel it when someone's talking to you.
Yeah. No, definitely get what you need.
Actually there.
Yeah. Someone's talking, with you versus at you, or to you versus at you.
Or worse. Okay, I'm going to show you this, not because I want to, but worse. Right? I'm not talking to you. I'm on this thing, but I'm just going to use my phone right now. Like, that's not being there. That's like removing yourself. Here's a barrier. This is a barrier. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty barrier, but it's a barrier.
Indeed.
Yeah, so presence. I guess I'm really passionate about this. Yeah. I feel like even now, with COVID going on and all these things, like, everything keeps coming back to, like, everything is asking everyone to come up with the being present. Like, how can we be compassionately present with each other, with ourselves.
Okay. So having capacity, just listening versus giving an advice, acknowledging, the truth in the situation, be it, it being a fucked up situation versus, they're in a better place. And this other part is having a presence of either actively or compassionately being there.
Absolutely. And if the person, if by chance you say to the person, like, I really want to be here for you, I want to help you, what can I do? And they say to you, I need your help to problem solve how I can fix this problem. Cool. Then you've just gotten permission to help fix it.
Yeah.
But if you're a mom and you're a parent, it gets tricky because you don't want to just give there's a level that needs to happen with each parent that, they need to also be the parent, and there needs to be some boundaries right there. It can't be all the kid deciding the discipline. So if there's some sort of weird stuff going on with the kid, that's a whole nother level, and they need to set some boundaries with the kid and figure that out. But that's going to be per household, I think.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Just so the parents aren't doormats.
Yeah.
The parents still need to be parents.
Indeed. Okay. And so this other part is talking about learned coping skills as a child versus revising or learning your coping skills as an adult. Right. And so some of the skills that we learn as a child or, in our younger years, once we get older and become aware of what has happened to us. Absolutely. Then you adjust how you cope to things to a much more healthier, lifestyle. So I just kind of want to have you talk about that aspect of coping skills and learning them.
Well, my first feeling of this was like, one would hope that one would want to learn. I think the first piece of that is a willingness to do it differently. Or a willingness, like if your coping mechanism is, it's to recognize too. There's different ways of coping that may have worked when you were younger that aren't working now. And some of that might be, let me think of can you think of an example where that comes up? I can think of a few, but I don't know if you were thinking of one specifically.
An obvious one that I get is drinking. So people using alcohol to numb themselves and then, or to forget. And then, after time realizing that, the use of alcohol isn't helping. And so they try something else.
So they try a different substance to numb them out.
Yeah. Well, some may be unhealthy. Some end up, choosing healthier ways.
So if they're alcoholics, they need to definitely get assistance with that. That's a deeper thing. But I would say that.
But nobody's an alcoholic until you go to the class, right?
That's I don't know if that's true. You mean until you say it? But I would say that we need to choose different things. And so there needs to be a willingness and an understanding that I'm choosing something toxic right now. There needs to be awareness around that. There's again, that impulse. I'm going for something toxic to numb myself out. There's that. And then on top of that, I always think that it's important to have some sort of practice, a daily practice where you connect to yourself in a way and that might mean different things to different people. Some people will do that as prayer. Some people will do that as meditation. Some people will do that as yoga. Some people will do that as artists. Some people will do that as musicians. Some people will do that, whatever it is, something that is some sort of practice that they can do. I think of it as like healthy pleasure that they can orient to. to choose on their path towards healing. And it may not happen overnight, but if they keep that impulse I talked about with the anger, if they can connect with the impulse of like, you know, that feeling of the reason I'm trying to numb out right now is because this feeling is overwhelming me and it is too much for me. So I need to do something right now that will regulate me. In somatic practices, we call the first thing we usually teach people is something called orientation. And it's about looking around the room and sometimes even just labeling it so you can feel. It's like what children do when they're, you know, when babies are born and they're looking in the room, they're like, who's here? You know, and they're just kind of looking around and labeling and seeing, okay, well, I'm actually here in the present right now. There's no, I'm talking about being in a room where you're safe.
Yeah.
Different if you're in like an unsafe situation, but I'm assuming the person is safe and they can look around the room and start labeling things and start recognizing that where they are in space. Because the numbness, there's something happening underneath the numbness that's pulling them towards the impulse towards something toxic. I would say sex is something too. People do that in relationship where, and not just drinking, but like they'll get into toxic relationships to numb out. Mm-hmm. And then it turns into this dynamic versus like going into and feeding themselves what they really need to be fed.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is orientate towards a healthy pleasure to satisfy an impulse. It's
Absolutely.
kind of what I got from what you were saying. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So
and literally look around the room too. So you see that you're okay in space, like literally start to, I mean, that is a practice, but I would literally look around the room. Like, you know, like right now I'm looking, you know, I see sculpture. I mean, literally be as mundane as cabinet, kitchen, sink, coffee maker, refrigerator. I like literally start to say it to yourself out loud so you can see. And you might think to yourself as well, this is stupid. Okay, cool. Keep doing it.
Right. No, I like that because it's like you are being in the present and actively identifying your safe place or your sanctuary.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you're not in a safe place, you probably need to remove yourself and go somewhere else immediately.
Correct.
Yeah.
I like that. Okay. Well, what are some signs that people are dealing with trauma and grief? Feelings, thoughts, actions.
We talked about some, like because I work a lot with professional women, and one of the things professional women tend to do is they overwork. So like they tend to be very type A and they're like working. And then suddenly a few years later, they're like, I'm really successful, but why am I unhappy? And I'm stressed and I don't sleep. But that overworking, constant overworking, spreading themselves too thin, accommodating everyone around them. With men, I see that too sometimes as well, but differently. Because for those women, they end up having they feel like they have 5 jobs, you know, like there's the job at home, you know, there's the job at work, there's so everything becomes kind of a job. It can play out with tension in the body, shoulders. I see this a lot with all genders and everyone, races, everything. Here, sometimes, you know, you've heard that phrase, they carry the weight of the world on their shoulders or something. A lot of tension in the shoulders. Digestive issues, it can definitely, you know, the gut is considered in some practices the second brain, but in Ayurveda, which is like a sibling of yoga, it's considered the first brain. And so, you know, you've heard of gut instinct.
Yeah.
So that's why I think that when the digestion starts to go, or it can go in 2 directions. Sometimes if someone's stressed out, I've noticed sometimes they can get serious diarrhea, and then sometimes it's the opposite, serious constipation. It depends. Like I said, each person is different. Reactivity, you're getting reactive about small things suddenly. There was actually a study done where when I was studying psychology, I did study psychology, and I'm not a therapist, but I did study psychology. I thought I was going to be a therapist, and I decided it was not the right direction for me because I wanted to do more body-centered practices. But I did do all the prereqs to get my master's. I didn't say that before, but I did. And one of the stories was about this woman, and she was terrified of people who wore green shoes, terrified of them. She had no idea why, but she was always terrified. And so the study went, it went back into exploring with her, why and what happened. And she realized that the person that assaulted her when she was like a little girl had green shoes. But to most people, green shoes would be nothing. Mm-hmm. But she had a strong response to the green shoes. So that's a sign that something is not attuning, that something is misattuned. People sometimes, if they're numbing out, or some people numb out on food, they'll eat too much sugar. They're pushing things down. I have a couple relatives who do that. Dissociation, when you talk to someone, like I said, presence, but sometimes people are just not present. It's hard for them. Let me see. Did I say everything I wanted to? Dreams. Sometimes dreams can be really intensive. And tumultuous relationships, also a sign. And constrictive patterns in general in the body. Like I said, all this stuff's energy. And so there's a book, actually, I've never read it, but I love the title, which is The Body Keeps Score. You might be able to hide it from your mind, but you cannot hide it from your body. Your body knows your story. Every single thing you've gone through is in your body.
Mm-hmm. So you, the last two, I didn't quite get, you said something relationships.
Tumultuous.
Tumultuous.
Yeah, tumultuous relationships.
Okay.
So if you tend to be in dynamics with people that are tumultuous, there might be some unresolved stuff going on. I see this a lot with in terms of like attachment styles. People who tend to be anxious types and avoidant types tend to love each other because they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Like the avoidant tends to kind of get over things within a few, like they have a hard time really deeply connecting, and the anxious type like loves connecting. So it ends up being this sort of Pac-Man relationship where they're like this. And but secure would be more, most of us need to work on being more secure because that's a healthier place to be. The tumultuous ones they're not as healthy. They might be fun sometimes, but just not as healthy.
Right. Okay.
But I just wanted to say again, like, the body's an amazing, intelligent thing. It's a temple. And it's used these things to help someone in the short term. They're just not working in the long term. But in the short term, these mechanisms, these signs, these coping mechanisms helped and worked. And I think they're important to honor.
I agree. And so the last thing you spoke on was the book, The Body Keeps the Score. And so I've read that book, and it's very good.
Oh, good. Yeah.
It makes me think about the full body assessment or life assessment.
Yeah.
Versus only being diagnosed and treated for, what you think you came in for. Some of the study and research that I have found says that there are some behavioral health professionals that lack the cultural implications to diagnose people.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so you end up misdiagnosing someone, and that further exacerbates, what they're going through.
Fascinating. I've never heard that before, but I'm not surprised by that. I know sometimes I know there are specialists who definitely diagnose people correctly and well. I've seen it and it's amazing, but I've definitely heard of misdiagnosis as well, and it's problematic. It's definitely problematic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just to kind of go back, because I want to get into the cultural aspect of this.
Yeah.
Do you think people or different cultures cope differently when it comes to dealing with trauma and grief?
Well, I do. I think it. I do. I think it depends on not just, its culture. And I think, even in thinking of the way that even like America versus like Europe and all the country, all those countries in there, and Asia, those cultures are going to all deal with things differently as well. They're going to do it differently than us. So I think that's important to recognize that we all have our different ways. I mean, yes, race, class, gender, accessibility, education. Some people don't know what a somatic experiencing practitioner is. They've never even heard of it. Do you know what I mean? Body-centered practices. Some people don't even know what that is. So they'll be like, oh, I should probably go to therapy. And so they're going to talk about it in therapy because that's what you hear about mainly. You don't really hear about what I do. You hear about therapy. Mm-hmm. Right? I should go talk to someone. And that's great. It's good to talk about things. It's good to be listened to. And then also there needs to be a place to address the body itself. But I think that accessibility is really important because some people don't have access to things. I mean, some people don't have access to a computer, and we're lucky. We have access to a computer right now and we can talk. If by chance COVID happened in 1984, this would not be happening right now. So we're lucky that the good part of 2020 is like we get to communicate virtually, which we wouldn't have been able to do like years ago. Yeah. And so collectively too, though, we inherit our parents' stuff, and we inherit our ancestors' stuff. It's not just parents, our ancestors. We are so whatever has happened in terms of ancestry, I think will live in our bodies as well. So that will also come into play. And how your parents handle their own emotions and their own traumas come into play too. In my own life, I just decided that I needed to go into a different path because I believed I could heal. And the way that they were doing it wasn't right for me. And I had to find my own way. They still think I'm a bit of a wackadoo, but I know I can help people, and I know that I'm much better, and I'm more healed now. And not to say I'm a perfect being. I mean, I always think that there's work to be done, but I definitely feel like I've gone through much more now than I would have said like maybe 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like how you put that. When you talk about culture, when you talk about trauma, and you said that we inherit not only our parents' trauma, but also our ancestors, it got me to thinking about generational trauma, and more so for me and, my family and culture dealing with slavery and racism.
Right. I think that comes into play. And so I think that your response to that, it's going to be different because of that ancestry versus someone from a different culture.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I say, and for me, it's not to have a discussion on racism. It's to talk about mental health when it comes to racism, because it's two sides to that coin, right? The oppressed and the oppressor. And so for my side, it is and I was talking to my son, and I was telling him, I was like, you have to look at it. I was like, your grandfather and great grandfather, and before them, they had to learn how to survive.
Right.
So I was like, me growing up, I didn't get a lot of I love yous or things like that because, they were in survival mode. We have to, figure this out, staying safe, And I was like, it wasn't until me where it wasn't necessarily survival mode that I had to get into, but I can transition into thriving. How successful can we now be? And so being able to display and show them love because we're now in a much better socioeconomic status and environment that we can do that. And so I think about, in that sense, that trauma and what each generation had to go through. And even today, how, you mentally deal with it, because with what's going on, you got COVID, you have what's going on with the politics with 45 and, this whole racist antics and this Black Lives Matters movement. And it's like, dang, how does one process this and maintain? And then on the other side, for a Caucasian person, a lot of people, they would say, you got a chance to live in a bubble. Right. And I don't mean that in a bad way, because I sit and I think about, okay, well, what was passed down from generation to generation? For me, it was, you need to be careful when you go outside because your skin color is a weapon.
Right.
And so you have to move and act a certain way so you look defenseless or harmless to the people around you. I don't think a Caucasian person ever had that story being told to them, or, that being passed down where you have to be afraid because of who you are and what you look like. No, and so right. you get to live in that bubble of security because, you're not having to deal with the fear or the hatred of what you are and what you look like. But that in itself is, is a thing. And so I remember I used to tell my soldiers that, I talked to a number of people. I said, those that have grown up with a silver spoon in their mouth versus those that have grown up with a wooden spoon in their mouth handle their PTSD and trauma differently. When you grew up with that wooden spoon in your mouth and you had to learn at an early age these different coping mechanisms of going to bed hungry, having the lights turned off, having to worry about where to sleep or, not having two parents in the household, all of these different kind of things, violence, stuff like that. You develop coping skills at a very early age to survive versus someone who has had everything and necessarily didn't have to develop those coping skills because it was no longer a threat to their survival.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That was the, before our interview, when I brought up Resma, he specializes in that. And that's something that book we were talking about, what's it called again? It's called My Grandmother's Hands. He specializes in generational trauma and racial trauma, and he brings all this up. And he actually, his perspective about the oppressor and racism and everything you're talking about, I feel like he would probably speak to this so much better than I would, because I felt like he really, he's really, that's his thing. That's his specialty. I will say that you're absolutely right. I mean, I was at a party in the beginning of the Black Lives, like right when George Floyd was killed. And like 2 weeks later, I went to this Zoom get together. And I remember being at this Zoom get together with like yoga meditation people. And they were talking about all of these things. And all I could think about was, this is such bullshit. Like, we're not talking about anything. Like, I don't even know why I'm here. Like, I'm so pissed off. I just felt like we're not talking about anything that's really important right now. And it's funny because a few days before, one of the people in charge and I were talking, and he said, I can turn off the news and I can walk away from it. And it's exactly what you just said. And I said, you're right. Like, I never thought about that in terms of like what you're saying, but yeah, you're right. You can turn it off. But what you're saying, Greg, is true. Like, there is a privilege there, and it's true. It's real. And I think that what you're bringing up about culture is absolutely accurate. Yeah. And I don't want to go into like, I mean, I don't like the, people were saying like all lives matter. That's like something that's been coming up on social media. And I feel like, sure, but that's not the point right now. It's not really the point. We need to talk about Black lives specifically because they're the ones that have been damaged.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, for me, I honestly don't even go down that path of Black Lives Matters or BLM. I more so just talk about Black issues.
Yeah.
Just because it's so much political.
It is.
Gained or red tape around it that you lose the value of what people are trying to do. And so I more so talk about Black issues and then also just police brutality as a whole, no matter what the race or the culture is.
I think it's important too. But one thing, even though I'm not a Black woman, and honestly, I would want a Black woman to tell me if I'm wrong here, because I'm just going to guess at this right now. But I would think a Black woman might have a different experience than maybe even a Black man in terms of all of this as well. My guess is that level of protection and wanting you to be very safe and all of that might come more into play in some way. And so when you're talking about culture, and variations of that, my guess is the gender there might react differently and maybe slightly, they may not have the exact same response. There might be I don't know. I just imagine like this, like, like the grandmothers, like wanting to like protect their young or like wanting to protect like their families and, that sense of that maternal, my guess is that response would be a little different.
Yeah.
And in terms of gender, I think most women would understand, like, they're probably not going to go running around a park at night. It's not safe for them. That's something that, like things that like going out after dark for most women, I would say, is not something they would consider.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't be safe. So they've been trained to like not leave the house at certain periods by themselves. They need to be escorted. They can't do it alone.
Yeah.
So there's levels of that there too, I think, that have, that can keep going. I mean, I remember my brother said to me once, he said, it was like 9 p.m. And he's like, I'm going to go running in Los Angeles. Got to mention Los Angeles because that's where I am. I mean, it's not like I'm in the suburbs of whatever. I mean, I'm in LA. Like, there's lots of stuff going on here. And he's like, I'm going to go running around this park at like 9 p.m. And I looked at my mom and I said, would you ever consider going on a run right now? Ever? After like 7. And she said, no, like, it's unsafe. Mm-hmm. Like, so we were like stuck and he's like, I'm going to go on a run.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just those even small things.
It is. You bring up, some really great points and we can talk about this like all day long. We can. But I what do you, I guess to kind of wrap this piece of this subject up, what can a person do to to help themselves when dealing with trauma and grief?
Well, a couple things. I definitely think people should have some sort of practice, do something to connect with your body. I mean, even if, let's say you don't have access to, I don't know. I always think people should work with a professional when it comes to this kind of stuff. But let's say by chance that's not available right now. Do some sort of meditation if you can. Do some sort of, I would exercise, make sure you're eating healthy. Take care of your body the best you can. Just focus on nourishing yourself the best you can, as much self-care as you could possibly generate. Otherwise, I would definitely get a professional. Some resources that I discussed with you earlier. If by chance there's someone on here who's like a professional woman and they're like spread too thin and they're exhausted and their sleep sucks and they have low energy and they're stressed and anxious and not feeling comfortable in their skin. I do have a program virtually that's called the Holistic Lifestyle Method. And they could go to my site at www.leslieporter.com. I'm a trained somatic experiencing practitioner, and traumahealing.org is, you could find the directory there if you want to find a somatic practitioner who works with body-centered practices. Some of them probably have insurance that they take. I personally do not take insurance, but there are people there that I think would. I would also look if you are, what you brought up about race and culture and generational stuff. I think RESMA is an amazing resource. That book, My Grandmother's Hands, RESMA, RESM as in Mary, AA.com is his website. And he has some wonderful talks on that as well that I've followed. I don't actually know him personally, but I know we're trained in the same things, and his talks are amazing. They're beautiful. And don't give up. Keep going. Be willing to look at yourself. And sometimes, even though pain is really uncomfortable and suffering, it sucks to suffer. It does. And that's an understatement. And I know how awful it can get. It can get very, very, very bad. But there are reasons that we keep going on. And it's for the people we love and our resilience, and it's important to keep going.
So let me ask you this question, because I found that there's one big risk factor that will make or break you. And it's isolation.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And so when you talk about not giving up and understanding that it sucks to suffer, how far you go down that road of isolation, for me determines, like how you bounce back from it. Some people, and I think about, I hate to put this out there, but I think about The Walking Dead. And it's an episode on The Walking Dead where the lady, she has lost everything. She has no hope, and she wants to commit suicide. And everybody is, saving her, telling her, don't do this. They're taking their guns from her because she's a danger to herself. And then she's so far gone that she gets a gun and attempts suicide, or at least contemplate it to the point where she had to make up in her mind that, okay, I don't want to do this.
Yeah, exactly.
And then there have been people that start to go or travel down that road of isolation and quickly realize that I don't need to go down that road. Let me make this U-turn, a pivot, and go in this direction. And so, I just kind of wanted to have you talk about isolation, and if you're so far into being isolated, do you have to get to that point of making this decision of if you want to live or not?
I think you need to do that before, if you can, because we're in a really weird situation, right? I need to get some water. I'm sorry. Hold on. We're in a really weird situation right now, and something we haven't been through in the world since like 1918. So we're in a totally, like, isolation's different right now than I would say it was 6 months ago. And ironically, strangely enough, it's strange because on LinkedIn, for whatever reason, BBC found me and asked me a very similar question and then posted what I said in an article about how to deal with stress and isolation, ironically. And what I said was, we need to stay connected. It's really important, if you know you're going through something awful, to find an ally and stay connected. And it doesn't matter who that ally is, as long as it's a safe, healthy ally. There needs to be an ally. And I know what it's like. I mean, I'm an introvert, and the level of isolation we've had to endure in California, I've had to definitely put myself out there and be more connected than normal, because I can feel that this is too much. It's just too much for even me, and I'm an introvert. So if you tend towards depression and you're in this place of being really isolated, like no one's going to understand, I think some people sometimes get into the mindset of like, no one's going to understand. I'm not okay. There's something wrong with me. All those messages that come up. There's also a part of them, and I believe actually everyone has this piece, and it's the wisdom within them. There is a wise part of them that needs to step in and recognize, because it's like the witness. There's like, there's that voice that's like the critical side, but then there's this wise side that needs to step up a little bit, because that's there too. And everyone has that, to recognize, okay, this is too much. I need to pull myself back, or I need to check in with someone weekly, and can this person be my ally? I have that with my best friend, where she is someone I check in with. Lately we've been doing it daily because COVID's been hard, and she has a young kid, and it's been very challenging for her to deal with that. But it's nice to know, and then we say to each other, are we supporting, am I supporting you enough? Is there anything else you need? And making sure that we're being the right support, because there's collective trauma, and we're isolated in a different way right now. But then if you have that extra isolation of PTSD going on top of collective trauma, you really do need to connect with someone outside of your own mind, because if you're not in your right mind, you need someone who has a more stable nervous system to help you along, so you stay on track.
Indeed.
So you're, what's the word I'm thinking of? I just started having a total brain. It's accountability. Thank you. I kept thinking assessment, but it's like accountability. Right? You have accountability to keep like,
yeah.
I mean, you guys had that. You had that, I'm assuming, as a vet. There was
For us in the military, we had battle buddies, accountability partners, and so they kept us on track. And one of the things that we talk about transitioning out is, coming from the military, you no longer have that structure, or nor the connection to all of your battle buddies, besides the effort that you put in to keep in touch with them. So you lose that sense of it, or you start to. And so having a battle buddy.
I love that name. I think we should use that in general. Battle buddy. I like it better than COVID buddy.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So having that battle buddy that you can check in with, that'll hold you accountable.
There was, you asked a question earlier of me, and if you're okay with it, it seems like we're going towards the end of our talk, and I definitely want to end with these two ideas. So let me know and I'll throw them in there.
Throw them in now. Let's talk about them.
Okay, cool. I love that idea though, the battle buddy, because it's like, or like warrior buddy, you know, someone who's going to like be right there to be like, come on, let's go. No. Or, you know, you maybe not be able to get together, but like, let's talk. Let's, you know, and maybe you don't talk about it. One thing I would mention is you may not want to watch things like, okay, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Maybe don't watch Contagion right now.
Right.
Maybe that's okay. Don't put yourself in the middle of, you know, like, you don't need to watch everything to trigger yourself right now. It's okay not to do that. I think sometimes we push ourselves too much.
Yeah. So limit your triggers.
Oh my God. Yes. Keep going towards what's pleasurable and nourishing versus healthy, pleasurable and nourishing versus like triggering yourself over and over again.
I know for me, like I'll watch, like, you know, when I'm just random and I need something to take my mind off, I'll watch clips of Wildin' Out or Family Feud with Steve Harvey. And, you know, that's my little pursuit of happiness. And instead of, you know, going towards my triggers, I pick up stuff that makes me laugh and happy. And so, like, I found that to be very, very helpful.
Sometimes, you know, those are, you know, that's healthy. And like, you know, the other night I watched Ratatouille. Have you ever seen that?
I have. I've seen it more times than what I want to.
When you watch it. But it was, you know, things that are lighthearted sometimes are what brings you pleasure is good. And it's, you know, it's good to do work on ourselves, but not stay there all the time if it's too much, if you're overwhelmed. But thinking of just two ideas. They're concepts actually from yoga. They come from Sanskrit and they're in the Yoga Sutras. They're in the philosophy and they're part of the 8 limbs of yoga. And one of them, these 2 words really have helped me, and I bring them into my practice a lot because I have found them, there's a certain energy around both, and I find them very supportive when, especially sometimes if you forget, because I think this is really a remembering and forgetting process. Mm-hmm. It really is. We remember, you know, someone might listen to this interview and they're like, oh yeah, I remember that. Like I need to be healthy and take care of myself and blah, blah, blah. And then in a few weeks, they might forget again. And then can you remember again with compassion, be like, oh, not crap, I should have remembered. But like, oh man, there I went again. My mind just went away again. I need to bring it back. But the words are ahimsa, which means non-harm to self and or other in words, actions, or deeds. The other word is satya, which means truthfulness to self and other in words, actions, or deeds, and or deeds. And I think that's really important to remember, to come back to that wiser self, to remember that in essence, none of us want to be harming. None of us, you know, like, how can we be truthful to ourselves? How can we be non-harming to ourselves and that of another?
Yeah. Okay. I like that. Non-harming to yourself, others, and or deeds, and being truthful to yourself, others, and or deeds. Okay.
In words, actions, and deeds.
In words, action, and deeds.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So when we talk about, so we were wrapping up on the topic of support. So I asked you, how can a person help themselves? Now I want to ask you, how can others help a person? And I know you touched on it a little bit earlier in talking about being open to listen versus, you know, like giving guidance and opinions.
Yeah, be kind. You know, actively listen. Ask them what they need. How can you better support? If you don't have the capacity, make sure you find someone find someone who has the capacity to help them.
Okay. Well, I got a bunch more questions, but I know we're kind of tight on time.
Yeah.
So I definitely want to get into like the last part. And so you dealt with trauma, you learned from it, you get the support to help yourself and from others. And, now you're getting over that toughest part of dealing with it, giving up, suicide, trying to redefine yourself, who you are. That whole journey is just a process in itself. And I know that hurt people. And so let's talk about making amends when dealing with trauma and grief.
Which can you give me? So like you brought up earlier, like, well, let's talk about that one client. She, what she did was she owned it. She basically said she was sorry and she cut it out. That space of the anger was coming up. She noticed the impulse. She started removing herself, wasn't perfect at it, but was getting better. And then she apologized for the reactivity. And she even said to them like, hey, this is something I'm working on. There will be some people who do not want to deal with it and who might go away and you won't be able to make amends. And then there will be some people who will be able to receive that apology. And I think that's rational. Depends how crappy the thing was, the event, the treatment.
That's true. And so if you had to, kind of put it in a process, how would you? Because I feel like you first have to become self-aware and forgive yourself.
Oh, yeah. I think, you have to heal more. You've got to show that your actions have changed.
So in healing, showing that your actions have changed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you've been mean to someone, I think it's important to show in action that you've changed. I mean, the trust has been broken. And trust is hard to repair. So think of it, the best word I could use here is repair. And for each person, that trust is going to look different. How can you repair with that person specifically? And they might need to tell you what that looks like.
Okay.
But this whole, I think that the theme is repair. The whole, this whole theme is, how do we repair ourselves so that we can help repair community? I mean, that's pretty much what each question has had to do with, repairing ourselves so we can repair our microcosm, the families we're in, and then the community, it all ripples out. But what happens too sometimes is I think that when you get more healed and repaired, people notice that they'll want to be around you more because it's easier for them. They probably will have more capacity to handle you healed because, for whatever reason, it's easier.
Okay. Well, look. What advice would you give someone?
Advice for which part?
Just in general, in dealing with trauma and grief.
Be as loving and kind with yourself as you possibly can. And know that sometimes the pain doesn't mean you're crazy. It just means you're human. And some people will get it and some people will not. And that's okay. They might not have the capacity to handle it. But that doesn't make them bad. It just means they don't have the capacity.
All right.
And that they're not alone. There's a lot of people out there experiencing that too. I mean, with so many deaths in the States right now, think of the families. It's a lot of families. that are affected. It's not just, I think sometimes we think of that number, but the grief that's going to surround that number, that's not going to be a small number.
Yeah.
I think you probably double or triple that for the people who are affected.
Yeah. And so what would you tell folks about seeking help when it comes to a licensed professional and a life coach or mentor?
Oh, I wouldn't do a life coach. I would go, especially with trauma, I would do what I was saying earlier, traumahealing.org, and go to their directory and find someone who specializes in somatic experiencing. I would not go to a life coach. They're not trained in trauma. Even if they've been through trauma, they don't necessarily, I've heard a lot of them talk about mindset, which is nice sometimes. It's good to talk about mindset, but I think it's important to go to someone who specifically knows about these bodies. All of these traumas live in the body. Somatic experiencing is pretty much the best practice I've seen to help trauma.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, look, I appreciate you for coming on and talking. Any last words of wisdom or encouragement you want to give before we sign out?
This was fun. I know we're talking about such a heavy topic, but just to end with, there's a reason your title is Guards Down. There's a sense of learning. How do you take your guard down? Right. And then sometimes learning how to put the guard up. Sometimes we need the guard up.
Yeah.
And then sometimes we need the guard down. And then learning to navigate between these two places, I think, is where that safety comes in. And so how do we create a place in our world where we're in line and attuning with our body's intelligence and organic process of healing, which can happen. Healing can happen. I swear, I know, I've seen it. That's, I think, really important. But then to recognize that all of these coping mechanisms, they really sometimes keep us imprisoned in our bodies. And then we need to learn how to get back to the flow of our bodies so that we can function and live more freely in ourselves. It's really about us. We might need to, remind ourselves it's important for our family too, but in essence, it's about our life force, what we've come in this world to do. And each of us has our own purpose.
Indeed. So, yeah. I like that.
I could go on and on and on, but you got it.
But look, tell everybody how they can find you, tell us about your efforts and what you're doing and how people can reach out to you.
Yeah, the best way is to go to my website, www.leslieporter.com. You can read about me more there, though it is a bit under construction right now. There's quite a bit going on, and there are ways of connecting with me on there. And if by chance you're on LinkedIn, you can also find me, Leslie Porter, and I'm connected with Greg, so you can always find me, I'm assuming through you as well in there. And you can also contact me through LinkedIn, which is a great way to contact me. Yeah.
All right. Well, look, everyone, I hope you have enjoyed the show. I know I have. Leslie, thank you so much for coming on. And we just want to tell everybody out there to stay safe, stay focused, and stay engaged. We're out.
You've been listening to Guards Down with Greg Washington. PTSD and complicated grief are very real. About 8 out of every 100 people will have PTSD at some point in their lives. About 20 to 54% of people with complicated grief will simultaneously suffer from major depressive disorder. And that's why shows like this are hugely important. Raising awareness for PTSD and complicated grief. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, hook up with us at guardsdown.com. We are iron.org, on Facebook at Guards Down, and find us on YouTube and Instagram.